Hello, everyone, and welcome to this last panel of the day. So here we're going to talk about the future of knowledge sharing. So what is the future of knowledge sharing? What is the promise? And what are the opportunities? Of course, we've got lots of digital technologies nowadays, and they can democratize access to knowledge, and we'll talk about that in detail. We've got people with very diverse backgrounds. They can also democratize the creation of knowledge. We've got 5G, VR, AR, AI, you name it, and knowledge is being set free like never before. But here's the question. Are the digital tools all we need to actually make it happen? And also, what are the strategies and policy decisions to truly get it underway? And of course, we have to bear in mind all the pitfalls and stumbling blocks along the way, because, what if we just repeat the old bias and shortfalls of knowledge sharing and creation, but amplified by these digital technologies and on a global scale? So we're going to address all these questions today, and there's going to be an opportunity to ask questions from the audience. So please wait until the end of the panel. I've got a great panel here with me today. And I'm going to let them introduce themselves, but just to tell you who they are, really briefly, Tonya Nelson, the Arts Council's Director of Arts, Technology and Innovation. Michael Markie, F1000's Publishing Director. Clive Thompson, New York-based journalist and technology writer who frequently contributes to Wired in the US, though not in the UK just yet, but hopefully we'll get him too. And Maria Nelson, Head of Innovation at Digital Catapult, UK's leading advanced digital technology innovation center. So why don't you guys introduce yourselves first?
Yes, so I'm Tonya. I am the first Director of Arts, Technology and Innovation at Arts Council England. And a big part of my role is kind of starting to think about, what is the next generation artist who's going to be using digital tools to create their work, to transmit their work, to engage audiences with their work. What do they need in terms of support from the Arts Council? How can we diversify the number of artists who are in arts organizations who are working with digital technology? And then how do we make sure that the great work that's done in the UK is being showcased internationally so that the UK keeps up its reputation for having the greatest in culture and innovation? Did you want me to go ahead and talk about the vision piece or just introduction?
Absolutely,
yeah.
If you have a couple of minutes.
So I'm fairly new in the role, but there are three things I wanted to kind of raise regarding the future of knowledge sharing in the context of arts and culture. One is that obviously it's going to be, artists have always been in the job, in the process or working towards revealing the world to us, helping us understand the world and helping us critically engage with the wider world. And so that's not going to be any different in the future, but it's a question of what digital technology will allow them to do. And they play such an important role in kind of challenging digital technologies, the things that Clive was talking about in his keynote, bringing to surfacing ethical issues. But what we've got to make sure of is that the artist of the future represents many different backgrounds, from ethnic diversity, class diversity. And so one of the things that I'll be doing is making sure that that next generation artist that's using digital technology represents and are reflective of the whole society, so that we get those kind of experiences and different perspectives into the artworks that we're using and that we're producing. The other thing I would say is digital tools are allowing us to engage with audiences in new ways. So with visual arts or theater or dance, typically it's a passive experience in which we are consuming a piece of artwork, whereas digital technology really allows us to be able to be more involved and engaged. And I've been lucky enough over the last couple of months to be able to see artists doing really innovative stuff with digital tools that allow audiences to participate more and exchange knowledge with artists and makers. For instance, I was just at Sheffield Doc Fest, where they have a VR portion of it, VR and tech portion of it. And you had artists who are working with artificial intelligence and are using the audience to train machines. So the knowledge we have is kind of training the machines that create the artwork. So I think there's really interesting ways in which artists are deploying digital technologies to allow us to be, I guess, more democratic in the way that we're exchanging information through artworks. And finally, the other thing I would say about the future of knowledge exchange is that artists are starting to work with academics in different ways. I think we know that there's a kind of model of residencies where maybe artists will work with a set of academics or academic department in order to help with the dissemination of knowledge or for public engagement purposes. But what I'm starting to see around the country is artists are working side by side with academics to kind of shape the questions that are being the basis for research. And they're starting to use artworks and the artistic process as a form, a mechanism of research, which is really interesting. And it actually provides a new way of thinking about not only how we disseminate knowledge, but how we generate new knowledge. What are the questions we're answering? So I think those are a couple of things I would say about the kind of future digital technology and knowledge sharing.
Thank you, Tonya. Michael?
Hi, I'm Michael Markie, and I'm the publishing director at F1000. And I suppose what we're trying to do is science itself and how that is shared and disseminated is actually not really changed for 350 years. So the first academic journal was published here in London, the Royal Society, Philosophical Transactions B. But as we've gone from paper to pixel, the scientific article hasn't really changed. And you'd look at a picture of the first ever journal and how it is now online, they're completely the same. And think of all the technology that we have. It's surprising that we haven't moved forward and being able to share all the research data, making figures and things interactive so people can really explore that kind of thing, hasn't really happened. And so what we're F1000's doing, and I'm working with funding agencies like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Wellcome Trust, is to try and create a platform for researchers to share not just the kind of summary of what they've done, but provide all the underlying data, provide tools for other readers and users to manipulate that data within the article and get a better sense of what that research is saying. And so pretty much what I think is, everyone thinks scientists, they're really forward thinking, and they are. But when it comes to sharing that knowledge and making it accessible to the academic community and also to the wider community, they've not actually progressed as much as we think. And so that's where I'm coming from, is trying to provide technology to enable scientific research to be shared more widely and more visibly.
Thank you. And we'll talk a lot about that, I'm sure. Clive?
So most of my work as a journalist has been looking at the way that technology and digital tools have affected everyday life. And for like 20 of those years, more or less, I was just going around and asking everyday folks, so like back in the 90s, you've got email now and instant messaging, what are you doing with it? And just writing down what they told me. And so I've been very interested in looking at a couple of big trends that I've sort of seen over those couple of decades, and going back a few centuries. I write historical essays too. I guess you could put the trends that I think that we're dealing with in a couple buckets. One is the sort of massive enfranchisement of everyday people to speak one-to-one and one-to-many, right? And that was just that, even 15 years ago was completely rare, to be able to easily communicate with a large number of people globally, or to communicate with one other person globally. That is still radical and still new. And it has, I think, bifurcated in a really interesting way, because for the first early part of this in the late 90s, there was a lot of very utopian ideas. This was going to be amazing, and people's knowledge sharing was going to be salutary and fantastic. And now we sort of look at this sort of slightly terrifying, toxic world of large social media filled with disinformation and crap. Like, what the hell went wrong, right? And from what I can, the way I think about it these days is that part of the problem is that there's actually multiple ways people share information online, one-to-many. And the big obvious ones are the very large corporate ones, right? Where you have these large social networks that are very centralized, Facebook, Twitter, whatnot, and they do a huge amount of what is essentially editorial work with their algorithms, picking stuff to be shared. And as I talked a little bit earlier, that can very quickly turn into a bit of a nightmare, because they're constantly trying to amplify extreme emotionality for the purpose of getting clicks. But there's also, that old sort of utopian ideal of the 90s is still shockingly alive, but in very small, more communitarian and non-commercial spaces. Like, there's still a zillion weird little forums out there where people are talking about whatever the heck their hobby is, whether it's snowboarding or crocheting, or in my case, guitar pedals. I belong to 3 different guitar pedal forums. And there's this massive, fascinatingly off-the-grid world of really, I think, actually salutary and amazing knowledge sharing going on. What seems to happen is that whenever large commercial interests get involved in this question of knowledge sharing, they sort of just break it in an attempt to scale it and turn it into something massive. So that's sort of the one large trend I've seen. A secondary one that I think we're going to continue to be dealing with, we're in the middle of it now, but it's going to accelerate, is the use of new modalities for communicating our knowledge. Like for several thousand years, it was text, right? That was it. Little bit of images. Beginning 15 years ago, photography explodes as a way for one-to-many and one-to-one communications. Beginning 5 to 10 years ago, video, or what you could maybe say the moving image, explodes, such as it is now one of the central ways for young people to learn something, to learn knowledge, and to share it. That's incredibly interesting and weird, right? That's an entirely new rhetoric that's evolving right in front of our eyes. I don't think anyone, and because I've hunted for the experts worldwide and tried to interview them, and no one has a damn clue what it means, I can tell you, basically. It's an interesting one, though. So those are a couple of the big trends I think I see in knowledge sharing.
Thank you, Clive. Maria.
Yes, hi, I'm Maria. I'm Senior Head of Innovation Practice at Digital Catapult, just across the road, but then we're all across the road. So. What we do is essentially we work with businesses of all sizes, from micro startups to multinational corporates, and we try to help them to develop and adopt advanced digital technologies. Advanced digital technologies being specifically a set of technologies that we're focusing on, that we've identified as hopefully potentially the biggest drivers of growth for the UK and global economies. And those are specifically IoT and 5G, so networking technologies, AI, so technologies that help you to crunch data essentially, and immersive, so technologies that help present data. And so you can see that it's a new stack, essentially a new technology stack, collecting data in a different way, aggregating, processing data in a different way, and then presenting it to the user in, say, immersive, virtual reality, augmented reality. So there's this whole new host of getting data, and I'm specifically saying data rather than information or knowledge. And so for me, that's actually one of the biggest points, is for us to be really cautious in the differentiation of what is knowledge, what is information, what is data, and what is it that we're aggregating, sharing, getting insight from, perceiving in different modes. I think in terms of the two big kind of meta trends, what I find interesting is one, access, as in 5G, for example, will allow access to enormous amounts of information and data in all kinds of shapes, video, pictures, text, audio, what have you, but immediately, like now. The latency, if you look at 4G latency, is about 40 milliseconds, and 5G allows you latency of a tenth of that. Enough, or as little, that you can actually use 5G for driving autonomous cars in the future. So it means you have video on demand on your phone immediately. Also the amount of data, so again 5G allows to connect up to 1,000 devices per square kilometer, so a load of sensors, sorry, 1 million devices, got my zeros wrong, 1 million devices, and we assume that we'll have around 1,000 devices around every single individual. And so everything, say, as an example in agriculture, you can sense everything. You can sense gases, so things that we haven't been able as humans necessarily to sense without the help of technology. You can sense, the soil, the state of the soil, the mood of the animals, noise levels. It allows you, if you look at agriculture, a whole different level of smart farming, for example. And again, smart, not necessarily knowledgeable, but based on a lot of data and insight that you can generate from that. So one is access. The other one is immediacy of experience, and that's really important in terms of how we generate knowledge as humans, because knowledge comes from learning, right? We as humans, we operate in our lives, we absorb information, and we generate knowledge through our own experiences and through what we absorb. And we do that in an immediate way. We are used to experiencing something immediately or reading it. Now, if you have immersive technologies that allow you a very, very reality-like perception of things, however, it's artificially constructed, so it's not your immediate perception of the world, you have a method of learning that's very immediate, very much like your everyday, you think you're traveling to a different country, it's all like being in a different country, but it's all in virtual reality. it starts, the process of generating knowledge become very, very different from what we're used to. And it becomes an issue as well, potentially, because we're used to relying on what we experience as truth, if I leave out the philosophical dimension, but we rely on that. And so the more that is fabricated, the harder it gets. And so I think that's the downside, and that's where that differentiation of knowledge, information, and data is really important. Just quickly, a good metaphor is if you think about the telephone book. So the numbers in the telephone book is data, essentially. So it exists no matter whether you put it in a telephone book or not. Somebody has a phone number that's assigned to them, right? What's in the book actually is information, and that is kind of formalized data, and you can share it. But knowledge is knowing that there is a telephone book, what's in it, what do I do with those numbers? If you think about an alien coming down to our planet and looking at a telephone book, they probably wouldn't know what to do with it. What are these numbers? How do I operate?
You don't need
an
alien, just take a 10-year-old probably.
Yeah, or a little human, yeah. What do I do with that? What does it help me to do? The context, the culture, the expectations, knowing that it's, if it's 20 years old, probably out of date, not even having a landline, all of these things, that is knowledge. And that's much, much harder to replicate, and it relies on reasoning, on experience, on connectivity in our brains. And so I think making that distinction is really, really crucial moving forward.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you, Maria. Lots of interesting points here, but I'd like to start with you, Michael. So how do we set knowledge free? How do we actually democratize access to knowledge? And you can start, I guess, with science, but going wider beyond science as well.
Well, coming from the science world, again, I'm going to be a bit down on us sharing knowledge, but only 40% of academic papers are actually freely available for the whole world to see. 60% of it is behind a paywall, which basically only the information rich can get hold of. And this is a big problem, and it harks to what Clive was saying. There's 3 or 4 major publishers who consolidate and keep all of this knowledge. They charge the public to access it when the public has probably already paid their taxes that have paid for the research. And so to democratize research, we have to take away the privatization of it. And I think, again, going back to what Clive said, we can't let a few corporations have access to all of this knowledge. It needs to be more widespread and distributed.
What do you guys think? Oh yeah, I mean, I think centralization centralization of the conduits by which we communicate to each other is one of the biggest challenges we have right now, right? I mean, it's like, and it's a problem because, I mean, certainly in the United States, they have completely lost the government has completely lost its bearings with respect to like the long history of antitrust law, where whenever something got too large, it was understood that this is a problem, not just for the economy, but for sort of civic life in general, right? That largeness, carries a power that deforms everything around it. And so that's sort of the exact situation we're in right now with these very few large companies. And I mean, you could say it's there with social networking, with the fact there's really only 3 or 4 companies that manage this. It's increasingly true in publishing. It's increasingly true in radio and TV, right? So we could regard this almost as a fractal facet of the problem that we're dealing with.
That's interesting. Actually, coming back to science, I do understand that lots of it is indeed in journals, but more and more of it is actually available online. And anybody from academics to the media to politicians can actually have access to those scientific papers written by scientists. So how do we make sure that what is being published is actually not just data, as you were saying, but actual knowledge? How do you propose we deal with that?
Yeah, and so an academic paper to a layperson can seem like a lot of data and a lot of figures and what's going on here. And I think the knowledge from that is using tech to kind of summarize what that paper is. Video abstracts are really big now on scientific papers, where people are consuming it by listening to the author discuss what their work has done and being able to digest it in that way. And so I think there's different mediums that we can use.
But if there's no peer review, though, then how do we know that the scientists who wrote the paper are not biased in any shape or form? Maria, what's your take on that?
Well, my take is always, where's the gap? Because even in the science, so if you look at a lot of pharmaceutical research, a very well-known gap is that a lot of the studies are mainly done on males because of different, actually, ethical considerations, but never mind. And even if they aren't, often the data isn't disaggregated, so you don't actually know what effects it had or didn't have on women. And so therefore, the conclusion is there's probably a lot of pharmaceuticals that could be accessible to the public that could actually heal certain conditions in women in bodies that react, say, to estrogen, and that haven't been because they were only tested on men. And so a lot of this isn't even disclosed in papers because it's often an angle, and there are ethnicity, age, all kinds of other angles that you need to look at, even looking behind the research. So actually summarizing a paper and saying this is what I've done is one aspect, and there's still, for me, more on the information than the knowledge scale. The knowledge is then to question, and this is also something that continuously evolves, because 20, 30 years ago, we didn't have those filters. Culturally, we didn't have those filters, or we didn't apply them. Maybe we had them. But applying those filters and then saying, okay, what's missing in here, that's I think, that extra kind of, third loop of knowledge.
Transparency around.
Yeah, and no technology can do that because it can't go beyond, and for the foreseeable future will not be able to go beyond analytically what we can do as humans and fixing those gaps of, you haven't looked at this.
It's interesting, actually. It makes me think there was this US congressman who once said, you're entitled to your own opinion, but not to your own facts. And that was, I think, in the year 2000 or something like that. And but now it looks like everybody is kind of using knowledge and creating knowledge any way they want, from politicians to academics to whoever, really. And so how do we actually deal with that? How do we make sure that knowledge we're creating, you were talking about it a little bit, like, fake news and all that. How do we make sure that the knowledge that's out there is actually real knowledge and not, not just data?
Misinformation, information.
Tonya,
I would just say also, too, it's about, facts versus fiction and real knowledge, but it's also about overcoming our own biases, so how we process information as well. So it's really interesting. A couple weeks ago, I saw an AI piece done by an artist and academic from King's College, so a neuroscientist from King's, and an artist, a computational artist, who created an AI application called Justice Syndicate, where it was basically working with an audience of 12, but actually they were jurors trying to think about a case, a sexual assault case. And they're really testing the fact that basically 95% of what we think is basically our internal bias, right? And information really has very little to do. We interpret information in the way that we want to fit our particular bias. And they're using the AI in a way to see how much information and what type of information actually changes people's opinions and moves them from different angles. And I thought it was really interesting because, one, it was an AI, it's a participative process in which those people could talk about what they were learning and the information that they were seeing on their iPads. Also, it was helping the neuroscience gain information about how people make decisions and how they think about things. So it was kind of live research going on at the same time. So it's really interesting to think about how artists can be kind of creative in helping us think through problems around knowledge and facts.
That's very interesting. Actually, speaking of AI, if we we're already using AI more and more, but knowledge created by AI, do you think, how can we deal with bias around AI and ethics around AI? Because, there's obviously, bias comes from humans, but also whoever programs AI, right?
Algorithms themselves, right?
Yeah. So and that's a key thing. I think that, for me, is one of the key issues, is getting more diverse population of people involved in the whole idea of data gathering, and participating in, whether it's technology via arts, whether it's programming, those types of things. That's the big question we have. I think it's raised by your gap issue around healthcare research, is who's kind of making the decisions about what data we collect, who's involved in collecting that data, and how we're using that data.
Absolutely. Clive, what's your take on that?
These are amazing points, because the fact that you can have tons and tons of sort of data and stuff and still have massive amounts of bias and ignorance. I'm very old school. This probably betrays the fact that I was raised in Canada in the 1970s, but there's no there's probably no coincidence in my mind that you've seen the rise of disinformation and the success of disinformation and sort of nonsense and conspiracy theories with the concomitant collapse of standards and funding for public education up and down the levels in many parts of the West, right? I mean, this literally is the one thing we know that's really good at allowing people to navigate information-rich environments and data-rich environments and sometimes knowledge-rich environments is having an excellent grounding in education themselves. And Western countries have really dropped that in recent decades. The United States is an absolute crap show, right? I mean, the quality of funding for education has plummeted, and it's become a highly bifurcated. Highly tailed distribution with wealthy people getting fantastic educations and everyone else getting crappy ones. And the one thing I learned from looking at a lot of research over the years about how people navigate information systems, how well they're able to learn and retain, how well they're able to disambiguate nonsense from valuable information, it tracks very, very well to education, right? And so this is sort of exactly what you'd want to do if you wanted to create populations that are gullible to powerful interests and nonsense. Is you'd slowly strip away the quality of their education. That's pretty much what we've done, right? So, and we did it at the worst possible time, right? Exactly as we create a massive environment for the creation of all sorts of new information, both good and ill, both wrong and right, both ridiculously biased and impartial. We've taken away the not the one, but a fantastic tool we have for equipping the population to disambiguate it. So I'm a big fan of massively refunding public education.
It's a very good point. Another thing that actually comes to mind, we were talking about technologies, and going forward, we're going to be using more, well, we kind of talked about AI a bit, but also virtual reality. And if more and more knowledge is accessible via VR, but there will be people who don't have VR. So aren't we creating a new digital divide, digital gap between people who do have these devices and people who don't? What do you think, Maria?
I think the gap is temporary. There's a gap now with people having phones and not having smartphones, but it's narrowing. It's also, I think it's less access, actually. It's access to what kind of information, because corporate interests will make sure that we do get access to VR and certain types of advertising, whatever will make money, people will get access to one way or another. But actually selecting cautiously the information that we have access to. It's not the access issue, it's what's in there, and also the literacy. And it's literally, that I find literacy an important term, because you talked about text, and this is how we learned. And you get literate by learning to read, and by learning, as in read texts, and by learning to write your own. And so that's why coding is not necessarily important, and all those digital skills, because you want to become a coder, but because you understand how it works if you've built it yourself. And so it's about that literacy. So I'm kind of slightly digressing from access, but it is about decoding what you see, literally. Yeah. And it's also, I think it's education, but also age. If we look at our parents, and they look at Facebook, and you try to tell them why that article is probably a hoax. It's intuitive for us, right? It's something about the quality of the image, the quality of the text, whatever it is. That is knowledge. That is the context that we have accumulated more digitally literate people, as opposed to a lot of our parent generation that maybe just haven't been exposed that much and haven't built up that literacy. And so I think it's less about the access and more about the decoding of what it is you see.
Absolutely.
I think Maria made a really good point in the beginning about the whole idea of business interests, and in terms of like the VR market, AR market, it's struggling. It's not meeting expectations right now in terms of adoption. But we know that there's going to be somebody in the business world who's going to figure out a way to create content that's going to sell, right? And I think one of the things with arts Arts Council, and I think with artists, is promoting them to create more content for VR, AR to balance that out. Because there's going to be advertising, there's going to be business use, there's going to be porn that's going to drive the market at a certain point.
Amazing healthcare. I don't want to be too pessimistic.
Yeah.
There's amazing. I work in the space, of accelerating that for good reason.
You can do it. You can say it.
Right? No, but there's amazing healthcare applications of speeding up recovery after a stroke through VR, because you can actually stimulate your brain to reclose those neural connections through VR. You don't even have to be moving, but it looks like you're moving and your brain is doing exactly the same thing. And training for doctors, training how to do surgery in remote places, all kinds of really, really amazing positive applications.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. We
As
have to
much
support
as that risk.
We have to support these new types of applications to get those out there.
Well, and I mean, I think the great paradox we have right now is that, like, including in these highly corporate spaces, there's like, the reason why they become enormously popular and valuable to people is that they genuinely do offer like remarkable forms of value. They're like, and even socially, we've seen certainly in the U.S. There's been these enormously salutary public conversations that have exploded entirely online because of people's ability to speak past decades of media ignorance of issues, right? So in the US, you have the Black Lives Matter discussion that began entirely online. You had decades of media completely ignoring systemic abuses of power against African Americans. And then finally, when they're actually allowed to document and share their experiences themselves, lo and behold, that can actually be something that finally edges its way into a public conversation. Never would have happened without social media, without highly corporate social media. The same thing with Me Too. Again, you had these realities that were completely around us but ignored by elite organizations, which I'm part of, right? I mean, I'm a journalist with those organizations. And it too explodes out because of the ability of everyday people to actually document what's really happening to them, right? So, so even as I'm, sort of concerned about, the corporate dictates of these things, people have created fantastic value and new magistery of knowledge that's been enormously important for social progress.
And I think that comes back to the point, though, that you made earlier about, what did you say? The fact that a lot of the corporate offerings are about generating that knowledge from information. And so I think we're at a stage where we are, as societies, a bit lazy, and we're taking for granted that it's knowledge what we're getting. Because somebody else has taken in business interest in generating knowledge from information, whereas it still needs to be us who look at everything as information and still train ourselves in a research, scientific, educational way of making sure that we are the individuals that generate our individual knowledge from information that we get, and don't rely basically on massive successful corporate machines that generate that knowledge for us and make it easily digestible and sell us something as knowledge that isn't really grounded.
Great. On that note, I would like to open up the floor to questions. We have about 15 minutes, so hopefully quite a few questions from the audience. Anybody? Yes?
I'm trying to relate to what I've heard during the entire day to arts. The talks were mostly mentioning knowledge and science going hand in hand, but if you, for instance, go to an orchestral concert and hear a piece of symphony played by an orchestra, where is knowledge in that for you?
That's a great question. Tonya, actually, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think nowadays, actually, this whole idea of the arts being here and kind of academic knowledge being here, that's coming together. And we're seeing how creativity and different modes of thinking can lead to different kinds of knowledge and understanding. So I think actually digital technology is allowing us to kind of start bringing those things together. And I think in terms of like AI and machine learning, right? I think there's a debate that people say, oh, the creatives will stay on this side and everything else will be done by the machines. But I think we're starting to see that merging where the machines are able to do some element of creativity, and there's going to be an interchange there, and I think that's starting to bring those two things together. So I very much see arts as a form of knowledge that we have to be better at.
I think the creativity will help people understand what the AI is as well, the other way around.
Yeah.
It's also for me about learning mechanisms. So it's about our own education, training, our perceptual different capacities. So, how you perceive music or how you learn a language, or all of that builds onto our human ability to absorb and process knowledge.
Yeah.
Or build.
It was actually your phone book analogy which triggered the question, because you made a very clear difference between information, data, and knowledge, the way people interpret. And then when you look at the symphony example, it is the formation of notes coming together to produce a specific piece of music, which is your data, arguably.
Yeah.
And then the way you need to interpret, is the knowledge in the program note you read, or is the knowledge what you hear?
It's for me, the knowledge is how you perceive it. It is that's still very individual, your mechanisms of experiencing the music, feeling, decoding, assigning meaning, connecting to other things that you've experienced previously, reasoning, all of that.
The thing that artists are really good at doing is wrestling with the material of the media itself, right? I mean, like, this is one of the things that is so valuable about artists when new media come along, is that they're the ones that get in there and just find all the weird stuff, right? And think about the way, in that McLuhan-esque way, that the medium is actually architecting themselves. And so it's always, to me, fascinating to see what people do with the new medium when they're making art with it, right? There was this wonderful clarifying moment. I remember in the early days of the photocopier, the 1960s and 70s, when artists started just realizing, wait a minute, this is essentially a new type of vision of objects, and started doing photocopier art. Unbelievably weird, interesting stuff. Same type of thing with video. When video came along, and originally was like taking their home videos and stuff and using it for public access, then a bunch of artists like, no, this is a weird, grainy, strange thing that's electromagnetic, and we can muck with it. And they started just rethinking what it meant to have democratic access of cameras. And these days, some of my favorite art are literally people who are using things like Twitter and Facebook to create art. One of my favorite artworks, it's online right now, it's called the Facebook Demetricator, right? So Benjamin Grosser, he creates a plugin that after you've installed it, when you go to Facebook, it removes all the numbers. Right? So you can see that someone has commented on something, you can't see how many. You can see that someone has friends, you can't see how many. You can see that someone posted something, but you can't see when. And it has this wonderful, in that classic artistic way, forcing you to look at the world in a strange new way, and to realize what Facebook is really doing is quantifying everything to get you obsessed with, the amounts of likes and whatnot. And by taking it away, you suddenly have this fabulously ecstatic new experience of it. And so I love the digital artists who are literally taking the material of the digital world and turning that into art. They're the ones that help us understand what we're really going through.
Wow, wonderful. Any more questions? Yes.
Hi. Personally, I feel like we're always constantly sharing knowledge via social media, via the mainstream media, via paper, newspapers. But we're also currently facing a pushback towards that, because a lot more people are more willing to just take things at face value without source and without actually considering whether it's real or fake news. And how do you guys feel that institutions and even individuals kind of react to that pushback and get honest, real scientific and sourced news out?
Michael.
I think there has to be some sort of verification process. So with a scientific paper, you kind of have to trust that it's been peer-reviewed traditionally. We're moving towards making the peer reviews available so people can read them and put more context around the academic paper themselves and kind of make their own judgments with some other experts. But I think, there's getting to a point now where, you'll read a story and say in the Daily Mail that, X cure for cancer, it should always be in mice, but they never put it, the journalists. And that's it. Always my nan had cancer. My mum would go, what about this study? Do you know about this one? What about this one? I'm like, Mum, it's all fake. I always want something to kind of verify that for them. But it's very, very difficult now because not just certain outlets are making fake news. I see it everywhere. There's misconceptions of what scientific is.
But did you say to me earlier that your site also makes like data available, so
Yeah.
people can actually work with the data itself and run the same tests and so verifying, making it the underlying data available, so you can draw your own knowledge from it.
That's really important for
Yeah.
AI, the transparency
Yeah.
of data and the replicability, so that somebody could actually generate the same result that you have generated. Yeah. I think the other thing to add to that is I think we've kind of we're running before we're walking the democratization of being able to publish your own information. We haven't quite caught up in terms of governance and ethics with that. So I think there was professional ethics in a sense. You know, journalists used to try to actually report facts, and politicians used to try to an extent to tell their truth. But it's kind of that's fallen apart, and there's this propagation of and even data sharing between organizations. All of that, I think we're in a bit of a gap, kind of, and we haven't caught up with actually instituting processes, governance, ethical guidelines, where we used to rely as a society on that being embedded kind of culturally and understood that you know, a scientist will do their best to actually publish something you know, to their best of their abilities. But I think we just have to catch up, and we're doing a lot in terms of data governance and establishing, you know, rules for organizations to work together in a more democratic level. But you have to put something formal in place where those kinds of cultural norms have just kind of been overtaken by technology, really.
Any other questions?
Hello. My question was, and I hope you understand it, was how accessible is this knowledge? So we speak about knowledge sharing, and I'm a local person, so I'm from Somerstown, I live next door. But I'm very privileged in the sense that I work for a corporate organisation in the area, and I'm also on the committee for the big local. So I'm aware of all of these institutions and these businesses and these things that are available and happening, as well as having experience of being a local person who doesn't feel that it's as easily accessible. It kind of feels like an electric cloud buzzing above the skies in King's Cross, like, you know it's there, we know it's happening, these things are happening, but how connected is it to local people in an area of such rich history and so much going on? How accessible is this knowledge? Does that question make sense? Yeah.
Thank you. Who wants to answer that?
I think from my perspective, there's a difference between accessibility and then discoverability or something like that. You know, in a sense that I think we're pushing very much to have things accessible, but how do people find them? And I think it's about us putting more energy into putting information where people can find them, where they'd be likely to go. As opposed to just making it available. Because I think you'll never stumble across it if you're looking here, there, everywhere. But if we worked more to make things accessible or discoverable by people and the places that they already go, I think we'd be much more successful in that endeavor.
Yeah, there's an over-reliance on, let's Google it and find the knowledge there.
Yeah.
Where, you know, across the road at the Wellcome Trust, they'll put on amazing art exhibitions about the history of medicine and X, Y, and Z, and you know it's going to be on at the Wellcome Trust, but some people don't know that, so maybe having something a bit more accessible on the street areas and, you know, drawing people in, because I think there is a laziness and an over kind of competence.
Also, how do you bring this into the communities? In an area that has sort of the British Library on its doorstep, how does that bleed into the streets of Somerstown? Like, what does that do? It feels like it should be something that is more accessible, not just that we've sort of ticked the box, we've got an exhibition and a general bit. So how does that become a part of this experience? It doesn't feel like it's so sort of above here and not a part of the experience of the people that are around it. How does it become a part of this knowledge sharing, or is it someone else's and we have to access it some way? Like, how is, you know what I mean?
It's
But the thing about it is that, I mean, to a certain extent, technology can only do so much for us, right? And now it's about going out there and not just relying on the technology to have it be there, but we still have to connect with each other. We still have to go out into communities and talk about what we do and those types of things. So I think there could be, in a sense, an over-reliance on digital. It's just out there so you can find it, you know, and we don't want to connect with each other anymore. Or it can be an excuse not to have to connect.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
I like how we were all struck dumb by that last question.
Yeah.
Very, very good one.
Oh, there's a question there. Yeah, perfect.
Hi, I think this came up earlier. I kind of like to rebut the last point because these things do happen. You know, the British Library, for example, has a whole education team, and I feel it's a bit sad that their work with local communities, local schools isn't really appreciated. And it's probably because we're not school age and experiencing these things. Yeah, so these things are happening, but maybe we're not the target audience because we're working within it rather than, and we're not working in the sectors that are actively going out into the communities, or at least the representatives aren't in this room.
The education team is very, very separate to the community teams. We work very closely with the community team, with Emma Morgan, and they work very, very separately. They don't work together. There's not actually, doesn't rebut the point. Actually, the education team is probably set up to work with schools, I can only assume. Is that right, Richard? So Richard would know who they are. I don't. I work very closely with Emma Morgan, and my understanding is they're two completely separate departments. So there's no actual education that is decided needs to happen in the local community, which makes no sense. But it would be great if maybe the education team worked beyond just schools. I'd love to. I mean, I went to China, quick story. I went to China and I saw the, wonderful story. I saw the terracotta warriors. And I was standing there, and this all the way in China, if anyone knows how far that is. I was standing, listening to a speech, and they said, we were at the British Library. And I went, I live next door to the British Library, and I didn't know they were there. I went to China to discover that they were on my doorstep. Things like that are just unbelievable, you know?
Thank you. We have time for one more question. Yes.
Just listening to you talking, two of you have made points about how people receive knowledge and information on the basis of what they already believe. This seems to be, how do you decide on what's subjective truth in this? And my big question is, how do you teach critical thinking in the wider audience beyond education, as it were?
Good question. Great question. Would you like to say, Clive? You haven't
Well,
spoken for a while.
Critical thinking is hard to teach. Has been for a long time. And one thing that I think, I've tried several times with varying levels of success to write about this, talking to educators and thinkers that sort of work on specifically that issue. One thing, it was very interesting that several of them have said to me, is that traditional ideas around media literacy seem to have failed in a really interestingly inverted way. One of the ideas beginning in the 60s and 70s that media literacy meant teaching kids to sort of scrutinize any individual source and take it upon themselves to be the detective that figures out whether or not it's correct. And I wouldn't call it a consensus because this is still being actively debated, but there's a significant number of media literacy people that now think that was actually a kind of a problem because it fed very strongly into the sort of epistemic nihilism of many forces in society right now that would like people to believe that nothing is knowable and no one is trustworthy, right? There is nothing more than authoritarians and despots like is when everyday people believe that every piece of knowledge is completely subjective. And so, in contrast, some of the world's best critical thinkers were trained when they were young not with this idea that the job of a critical thinker is to constantly be scrutinizing everything. They were just given a good old-fashioned large body of knowledge about the world. They knew a lot of things. And when you know a lot of things, it becomes a lot easier to sort of figure out whether something new that's coming in fits with what exists and known, right? You have a greater sense of authority. You have your own authority because you actually have some. And so this is not really in any way an answer to your question because I don't. If I knew how to teach critical thinking, I would have learned it from talking to the people who have been trying to figure out how to teach critical thinking, and they're confused too. But they do wonder whether or not one strategy that was a central strategy for the last 3 decades might be partially awry.
But I think one answer is effort. I think one thing that we forget often is effort. So AI, and it just gives us the answers, and
It must be
I
right.
mean, background, I don't know. I work in technology, I have a humanities PhD. I very much believe in a thorough, long humanities education that can benefit across all kinds of different areas of work. But one thing that you don't get around in learning an instrument or whatever, critical thinking is just a lot of reading. I think part of it is, yes, you generate knowledge based on the knowledge that you have, but I think it's a little bit more critical than that. It's not exactly, it doesn't necessarily replicate your knowledge. I think it's more like learning a language. The more languages you know, the easier it is to be to learn a new system, yet another language in another system. But it might be different, and you will be able to, see what works, what doesn't work. But it's just this kind of self-replicating. If you've learned to absorb and question a lot of information, it's going to be easier to continue doing that. Whereas if you don't have education that even sets you up to be able to deal with that amount of information in any kind of productive way, then you're never going to get beyond, just believing whatever's on the page. So I do think it's about time and investment, as you said, really.
Do you guys have anything to add to that?
I was just going to say that, I think this new, in terms of the arts, in terms of immersive arts and immersive theater and kind of getting people to be actively engaged with art is a really good way of fostering critical thinking. And so I'm quite encouraged by that. I'm encouraged by artists who are doing more participative type work where people can be challenged, can be engaging in conversations, because that just gets the skill going. I mean, I just think back to, I went to an immersive theater program that was about the dangers of having too much data online. And I went through this thing just as an audience member, and I was shocked by, first of all, how much they found out about me to tailor this experience. I was just completely shocked. And then how much I trusted what people said, and I was giving information because I was trusting, and it just made me think, oh my God, I'm walking around like a dummy through the world, giving away information and doing this. But it was a great way of kind of making me think critically about things. So I have some optimism in that.
Awesome.
Thank you. I think we're out of time, but thank you very much for coming, everybody, and thank you to our great panelists.
Yes.